Why did Frida walk with a limp? What inspired her to create the beautiful portrait, self-portrait, dual portrait of the two Fridas? What effects did the Mexican Revolution have on her family? That and more in today's video. Hi everyone, I am Jessica Gonzalez-Gibson, the leading lady of Kaleidoscopes and Polka Dots, where I sell handmade, vintage-inspired jewelry that honors Hispanic American heritage. A lot of my pieces are inspired by Frida Kahlo. She is integral into me being who I am, and that's why I'm here creating this series for you. I'll link my shop in the description box if you're interested in browsing. If you're interested in saving 20%, please sign up for my newsletter. This is also the best way to stay in touch and to know whenever I post another video. I'm considering offering the slides that I create for these presentations free for those that subscribe to my newsletter. I'll probably do it bi-weekly or something like that, just so that anybody who's interested, they take some time and they have some interesting information that some of you might find interesting to integrate in whatever it is that you are creating, because I assume many of you are just here because you love art, or maybe you're doing a little bit of research yourself. Please know that most of the content that I'm covering is available to you through Hayden Herrera's book, Frida, a Biography of Frida Kahlo, and Hayden Herrera's other book, Frida, the Paintings. Any other sources I do try to link in the description. I'm not always as successful as I want to be, but please know that I am trying. Moving on to today's presentation. So first, let's do a little bit of a recap as to Frida, her name, and her date of birth, because I'm just fascinated. Okay, so Frida's full name is Magdalena Carmen Frida Kahlo y Calderón. Her first two names were given to her so that she could be baptized with a Christian name. The third name, Frida, means peace in German, and it is spelled with an E instead of an I. As a way of paying homage to her German heritage, Frida spelled her name with an E until the late 1930s, so when the rise of Nazism took over in Germany. Frida was Guillermo's favorite daughter, and she was also the third daughter between him and Matilde. He, of course, was married previously to a woman with whom he had two daughters. Frida was born on July 6th, 1907 at 8:30 in the morning in the midst of a summer rainy season when the high plateau of Mexico City was dank and cold. And why am I bringing this up again? Because I wanted to look up her astrology chart. This is where a lot of you probably roll your eyes, but I think it is fascinating. And if you too find this kind of stuff fascinating, well, let me just say, according to Next Astrology, all of that information considered, her sun sign is Cancer, her moon sign is Taurus, and her rising sign is Leo. And I can definitely see Leo in Frida. Strong-willed, courageous, and absolutely self-involved. I can definitely relate. So let's go back to when Frida was a baby, because this would inspire a future painting, as most events in her life. Most of her paintings are self-portraits in one way or another, as Hayden Herrera notes it in her book, Frida, the Paintings. Shortly after her birth, Matilde, Frida's mom, became ill with seizures or attacks, very similar to those of her husband's, and so she couldn't feed Frida. And as a result, Frida was breastfed by an Indian wet nurse. Of this, Frida spoke proudly, noting, "I was nursed by a nana whose breasts they washed every time I was going to suckle." This event would later become a source of inspiration for painting My Nurse and I, where an Indian wet nurse was portrayed as a mythic embodiment of her Mexican heritage, and herself as an infant at her breast. My Nurse and I could double as a self-portrait. According to Hayden Herrera's book, Frida, the Paintings, the nurse has loose, stringy black hair like Frida's, and inscribed it in her Teotihuacan mask. Her eyebrows join, just like Frida's. Thus, as in several later paintings, the weak, vulnerable half of Frida is nurtured by the strong, self-sustaining aspect of herself. Usually, the strong side of Frida's durability is her Indian half. The pale-skinned Frida is the more vulnerable side of her. This is a theme that she would convey to us in future paintings. Of this, Hayden notes, Frida was her beginning and her end, her creator, her nurturer, and her destroyer. I love that. Aren't we all? I hope we're all. It's like in that movie, what's it called? The Holiday. If you can't be the leading lady of your own life, then you're doing something wrong. And Frida definitely understood the assignment. And just because I found it interesting and adorable, Hayden describes Frida as a chubby baby with a dimple in her chin and a mischievous glint in her eye. Isn't that just indicative of who she'd become? Many of us, I would say most of us, often become what we were as babies, except exponentially better or worse. Now, let's go to kindergarten years. Frida in kindergarten. Frida went to kindergarten when she was 3 or 4 years old. Of this, Frida said, the teacher was old-fashioned with false hair and the strangest dresses, which I mean are probably Victorian dresses, which I can see how they would be weird because back then, as we learned last week, and we'll probably talk a little bit about it more in this and future episodes, Porfirio Diaz was really intent on welcoming European culture and aesthetics. Moving on. So, Frida notes, my first memory of this teacher was that she was standing in front of the dark classroom, holding in one hand a candle and in the other an orange, and explaining how the universe worked, the sun, the earth, the moon. Oh my gosh, it made such an impression on me that I urinated. And something that I didn't include, but I should have included, is that afterwards, the teachers had to ask for help from fellow students, and one of them lived nearby, and she lent her some clothes. And Frida was not too fond of this situation because it embarrassed her. And as a result, she took it out on her, being incredibly rude to her afterwards. And by incredibly rude, I mean she described physical harm, although Hayden says that while she might have described physical harm, it was probably more of an exaggeration because she was apt to exaggerate as a way of storytelling. Here we see exactly how Frida's brilliant, curious mind would develop and become what it was, what we know her to be. Okay, moving on from kindergarten and on to Frida's first major health issue, which was polio. Years later, she transformed into a thin-framed, withdrawn child, given her bout with polio at the age of 6. This would lead her to prolonged periods of isolation and pain. And if you don't know, because I too forgot what polio was, polio is short for poliomyelitis. It is a viral illness that attacks the nervous system. In mild cases, it causes fever, fatigue, and aches, and in severe cases, it weakened or paralyzed muscles, often in the leg. Polio was very common in the early 1900s across Europe and the Americas. Children were most vulnerable, especially before vaccines existed. Outbreaks arrived each summer, unpredictable and feared. At the time, it moved quietly through households, leaving lasting marks, as would happen with Frida. So, how was it treated? There was no cure then for polio. The treatments were care, not healing. And what were these treatments? They were bed rest for prolonged periods of time, physical therapy and massage, braces or orthopedic shoes to support weakened limbs. Later, machines like the iron lung were used for severe breathing paralysis. For Frida, polio left her right leg thinner and weaker. A quiet difference she carried it into adulthood. It shaped her body, but it also deepened her awareness of it. And of course, pain became familiar and endurance became intimate. Clearly, this would prepare her for one of the most tragic events, I would say, to happen in the early 1920s. And we'll talk about that. Let's talk about Frida's personality. Was she an introvert or an extrovert? I would say that she is extroverted introvert, mostly out of circumstance. Let's elaborate on that. The curious combination of being at once self-fascinated and outgoing that characterized Frida as an adult may have become in the sick child's exacerbated awareness of the dependency between the inner world of daydreams and the outer world of social development. Frida became a prankster at an early age. She even went as far as teasing her father. She poked fun at his German ways by calling him Herr Kahlo. You know, another reason why I love studying Frida so much is because it reminds me that whatever we think of others, we never know what their story is. We don't know what their background is. We're just propelled by whatever it is that is popular at the moment. And by that I mean on social media. That is why I'm so opposed to calling out cultural appropriation. You don't know what you don't know, and that's okay. But to presume to know and then to be vicious about things. That's not okay. Moving on to Frida's recollection of polio. Of the diagnosis, Frida recounted, "It all began with a horrible pain in my right leg from the muscle downward. They would wash my little leg in a small tub with walnut water and small hot towels. Once removed, a doctor recommended a program of physical exercise to strengthen her withered right limb. Guillermo, who had usually been tender and concerned during his daughter's illness, made sure that she took up all kinds of sports, which were considered highly unusual for respectable young girls in Mexico at the time. She would play soccer, she boxed, she wrestled, and she became a champion swimmer. Of this, Frida recalled, "My toys were those of boys, skates, bicycles." Unfortunately, though, her leg remained very thin. She recalled, "When I was 7, I wore little boots. In the beginning, I supposed that the jokes about my leg didn't injure me, but afterwards they did, and as time went on, more intensely." To hide the right leg, she wore 3 or 4 socks on the thinner calf and shoes with a built-up right heel. Frida's childhood friend, the painter Aurora Reyes, said, "We were quite cruel about her leg. When she was riding her bicycle, we would yell at her, 'Frida, pata de palo! Frida, peg leg!' And she would respond furiously with lots of curses." Others admired her determination in physical activity. They remember her black bloomers showing, pedaling her bicycle like a demon around the Central Park. She was extremely well coordinated and graceful. When she walked, she made little jumps so that she seemed to float like a bird in flight. But she was a wounded bird, and being wounded, she was different from the other children, often lonely. Just at the age when she might have expanded her world beyond her family circle and made best friends, she was forced to stay home. When she returned to school, she was teased and left out. Her reaction was alternately to withdraw and to overcompensate by becoming the first tomboy and later a character, which was the most Mexican of Mexicans. Polio was the beginning of the transformation. All of her life, she hated the withered leg that resulted from the illness, and she hid it with long Mexican skirts and compensated for it by becoming the most Mexican of Mexicans. So, the transformation, of course, would become her signature staple that often perplexed everybody because this was the 1920s, and she continued to exude this aura of Mexican pride with these traditional dresses. How beautiful. Okay, so what inspired her to paint the 2 Fridas? Let's go back to when she was 6 years old, and this is a recollection of hers. "I must have been 6 years old when I experienced intensely an imaginary friend with a little girl, more or less the same age as me. On the glass window of what at the time was my room and which gave onto Allende Street, I breathed vapor onto one of the first panes. I let out a breath and with a finger I drew a door. Full of great joy and urgency, I went out in my imagination through the door. I crossed the whole plain that I saw in front of me until I arrived at the diary called Pinzón, where my imaginary friend was always waiting for me. I do not remember her image or color, but I do know she was gay. She laughed a lot. Without sound, I followed her in all her movement. And while she danced, I told her my secret problems. Which ones? I do not remember. But from my voice, she knew everything about me. And here she is, sharing her deepest pain and wounds, and she is completely understood. At least that is what I gathered from this painting. So her sisters. She had nothing but sisters. Guillermo's first marriage resulted in 2 daughters, and his marriage with Matilde resulted in 4 daughters. So Frida had 5 sisters. Her eldest half-sisters were Maria Luisa and Margarita. Otherwise, there was Matilde, Adriana, and Cristina. Cristina was the chubby one, and I believe the one that she was closest to, and the one that would betray her the most, as we'll learn. If you haven't already watched the movie Frida, I highly encourage you to watch it. It's beautiful. It was produced by Salma Hayek. She stars in it. She has quite a piece about the man who shall not be named, but oh my gosh, what a beautiful movie. Anyway, moving on. So Frida and her younger sister Cristina were cared for largely by their elder sisters, Matilde and Adriana. And when Maria Luisa and Margarita were not in the convent because Matilde urged Guillermo to send them to a convent, they would also take care of Cristina and Frida. And as happens, Margarita ended up being a nun. In 1912, Matilde, Matita, the daughter, not the mother, and as it happens, Frida's mom's favorite daughter, ended up running away with her boyfriend. At the time, she was 15 and she ran away to Veracruz. And Frida helped. Frida helped by opening the balcony door and closing it to hide her getaway. Frida was 7 at the time. Maybe because she was her favorite daughter, Frida's mom had a hard time forgiving her. It wasn't until 1927 that she finally welcomed her home. Not for a lack of trying on Matita's side, because as we know, moms can be incredibly stubborn, but our hearts are with our mothers and we just want to do the best for them, right? And we want to leave our lives. So I understand both sides. The hurt on Matilda's side and the wanting to expand and spread your wings like Matita did. Guillermo of this event didn't say much. He was a bit withdrawn for many reasons. I believe a lot of it had to do with the financial hardship that they endured. Once Matita and Matilde reconciliated, Frida wrote to a friend saying, "Mati now comes to the mansion. Peace has been made." Let's talk about Frida's mom a little bit more. We talked about her previously. She's an incredibly pious woman. As it happens, Frida grew up to be agnostic. Frida, like most of us, had a very challenging relationship with her mom, and I think it's because of the faith. But she described her mom as cruel and very nice, active, and intelligent. Of how she could be cruel, Frida recalled that once upon a time, she drowned a litter of rats. And on the other hand, her lack of formal education often left her out, but nonetheless, she was very intelligent, especially as it related to finances, which would become incredibly invaluable to the whole family. Frida's nickname for her mom was Jefe, chief. And as they grew older, Frida's relationship with Matilde would become more intense, and yet when she passed away, Frida couldn't stop crying. Matilde was like the traditional homemaker, and she was also the local curandera, or she became the local curandera when needed. Not quite as active, at least from what I understand, from what I've read between the lines. She wasn't quite as involved as her mom was when Matilde was growing up, but she knew all the things. She knew how to cook, sew, clean, embroider. All of these are skills that she passed on to her daughters. And unfortunately for her, none of her daughters ended up being quite as religious as she, especially Frida and Cristina. So moving on to Frida's relationship with her dad. Have I already said that Frida was Guillermo's favorite? She, of all of his daughters, reminded him most of himself. I mean, self-involved much? It runs in the family. Frida, as we learned, had quite the sense of humor and poked fun at Guillermo Kahlo's German ways by calling him Herr Kahlo. He was a man of fixed habits. He did not have much time for his children. He left home early in the morning for his studio at the corner of Madero and Motolina above La Perla, the jewelry shop where he had once worked in the center of Mexico City. Because of the distance from Coyoacán, he did not follow the Mexican custom of going home in the middle of the day to eat a large comida. Instead, Señora Kahlo prepared his lunch in a Mexican basket and sent it to him with the houseboy. He'd come home at the same hour every day. Solemn, curious, a little severe, he greeted his family, then played the piano for an hour. He ate dinner alone with his wife. Then he'd go back to the piano before retiring to read. While not intimate with his children, he was very attentive to his favorite. He stimulated Frida's intellectual adventurousness, lending her books from his library and encouraging her to share his curiosity about all manifestations of nature. When she was old enough, he also shared with her his interest in Mexican archaeology and art and taught her to use a camera to develop, retouch, and color photographs. And although Frida did not have much patience for this exacting work, something of her father's fastidiousness, his concern for minute surface detail, would later appear in her own paintings. Certainly, the tiny brush strokes and small scale that retouching photographs entails became second nature to Frida, and the stiff formality of her father's portraits affected her approach to portraiture. Acknowledging the link between his art and her own, Frida once said that her paintings were like the photographs that her father did for calendar illustrations, only instead of painting outer reality, she painted the calendars that were inside her head. After Frida's bout with polio, the two were drawn even closer to each other, bound by a shared experience of illness and loneliness. Frida recalled that her father's attacks frequently occurred at night, just before they went to bed. When she was a small child, she was hustled out of the way. Nothing was explained to her, and she would lie in bed in fright and wonder. In the morning, she was equally perplexed. He became a kind of fearful mystery for whom I also had pity. Later, she often accompanied him on photography outings to be there when he needed her. She notes, many times when he went walking with the camera on his shoulder and me by the hand, he would suddenly fall. I learned to help him during his attacks in the middle of the street. On the one hand, I would make sure that he immediately breathed alcohol or ether, and on the other, I watched so that his camera would not be stolen. Years later, Frida wrote in her diary, "My childhood was marvelous, because although my father was a sick man, he was an immense example to me of tenderness of work, photographer and also painter, and above all, of understanding for all of my problems." So let's talk about the Mexican Revolution because it had quite the effect on the family dynamic. So first, let's do a brief overview. So Frida was about 3 years old when the Mexican Revolution broke out, and it would last 10 years. It began with uprisings in various parts of the country and with the gatherings of guerrilla armies in Chihuahua under Pascual Orozco and Pancho Villa, and in Morelos under Emiliano Zapata. In May of 1911, Porfirio Diaz, the Mexican dictator, was overthrown and exiled. Porfirio Diaz was replaced by Francisco Madero in October of 1912 via elections. Unfortunately, his presidency would end following the tragic 10 days, or La Decena Trágica of February 1913. So what was the Decena Trágica, the tragic 10 days? For 10 days, Mexico City became a battlefield. Artillery thundered through civilian streets, trucks collapsed behind closed doors, and at the center stood Francisco Madero, the idealistic president who had helped ignite the revolution by overthrowing dictatorship. He believed restraint could preserve peace. Opposing him were rebel generals, conservative elites, and quiet conspirators within his own government. That conspirator was namely Victoriano Huerta. So what happened? A military uprising erupted in the capital. Heavy shelling devastated neighborhoods and civilians. Huerta pretended loyalty while negotiating Madero's removal. Madero was arrested, then assassinated days later. The presidency fell, and the illusion of unity fell with it. Why it mattered. Madero's death transformed political reform into open civil war. It radicalized resistance and deepened resolve. From this moment, figures like Emiliano Zapata and Pancho Villa fought not just for change, but against betrayal itself. In the north, Venustiano Carranza, the first chief of the Constitutionalist Army, along with a small body of troops, rose to avenge Madero's death and overthrow Huerta. The Mexican Revolution came to an end in November of 1920, after the election of President Álvaro Obregón, one of Carranza's generals. Frida's memory of the tragic 10 days. She notes, "I remember that I was 4 years old." She was actually 5. "I witnessed with my own eyes Zapata's peasants battle against the Carrancistas. My situation was very clear. My mother opened the windows on Allende Street. She gave access to the Zapatistas, seeing to it that the wounded and hungry jumped from the windows of my house into the living room. She cured them and gave them thick tortillas, the only food that could be obtained in Coyoacán in those days." So how did the Mexican Revolution affect Frida's family? Unfortunately, it was devastating for Frida's family monetarily, given that Guillermo's work was funded by the Diaz government, which provided him with enough funds to invest in a plot of land in Mexico City, where he'd build the Blue House. Following Diaz's removal, Guillermo had a hard time finding work as a photographer. They had to mortgage the house, sell their French living room furniture, and at least at one point take in a paying guest. It was Matilde's financial savviness that kept the family afloat during these challenging times. Of this, Frida notes, "She did not know how to read or write. She only knew how to count money. She did it well. I assume this is also what inspired Frida to create her painting of 1938. They ask for airplanes and are given straw wings. Frida combined her recollection of a minor childhood disappointment with her memory of her freedom of movement being curtailed by polio, and with her current frustration at being immobilized by surgery on her foot. Of the painting, Diego Rivera also recalled the time when her parents dressed her in a white robe and wings to represent an angel, wings that caused a great unhappiness because they would not fly. In the painting, Frida is about 7 years old. She holds a model airplane. The straw wings that she did receive are suspended by ribbons descending from the sky. Clearly, they cannot fly. To drive the point home, Frida wound a ribbon around her skirt and nailed the bows at either end to the ground. In the next episode, we're going to talk about Frida and her preparatoria years. Guys, my Spanish is not the best, okay? I'm trying. We're going to learn more about Frida, a little bit less about her family, but more about Frida as a witty teenager who is coming of age and falling in love for the first time. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please give me a big thumbs up. Please do subscribe to my newsletter so that you never miss an episode. And as always, please don't forget to register to vote. Be kind to one another. Kindness trumps anything else, always.